Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome. This is the last one of the summer series, and so we have another guest speaker, Dr. Prologo, and he's going to be talking about working with industry, and this is a very different way of writing your proposals, and I'm calling them proposals now, not grants, because they aren't. The majority of time they are contracts, which is a very different beast. So go for it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Krupinski. Good morning, everyone. Everyone can hear okay, presumably. My name is Dave Prologo. For those of you that don't know me, I'm an assistant professor. Oh.
Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Didn't go like this, no.
It's like go to meeting.
Oh, I see. I see what you mean. Oh, I see.
Yeah,
so
you might have to. You can try it that way, see if it advances.
So let's see. Sorry. Did you just touch the screen?
No.
Yeah.
You might have to just put the cursor and click.
Okay. Let's see. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. All right. So I'm an assistant professor. I'm an interventional radiologist, and I've had some experience, a good amount of experience actually, working with industry, working with vendors, parlaying shared vision into some projects and future grants. And I'll talk about those things, try to give insight from my experience, try to share what I've learned over the last few years. The talk itself, the outline, I'm going to spend some time on the big picture, which is what I think is important. I spend a great deal of time actually around the water cooler and in between cases, talking with my colleagues, talking with my PhD colleagues about what we know and don't know about the big picture and how industry fits into that. And then, as Dr. Krupinski mentioned, grants and contracts are two very different things, and then I think there's a space in between that can be exploited for our shared goals. And then conflicts of interest are always at the forefront, especially when taking money from industry for any reason. The mechanisms to the money are in fact different. They're not grants, they are proposals, and the route to the actual money in the bank is a little bit different. And then the return on investment for both the industry sponsor as well as the investigator. And I encourage everyone to please stop me along the way. Disclaimer, I have not given this talk before, so if there's something missing from one of the slides, please don't feel like we have to wait to the end. Just interrupt me and we'll try to get the most out of the talk as a whole. So to start with the big picture, especially from the clinical side, it seems that we sort of enter in on day one or enter in to Emory or our academic center, our academic job in the beginning, and we have visions of the ivory tower. We have visions of our own laboratory, of parlaying our discoveries, the evolution of our research into potential IP, and then maybe income, as we can see here on the far right. I'm not sure. Do I have a pointer, Dr. Krupinski, for the slides, or I just bring up my arrow?
No, you can't.
Okay. All right. That's okay. So I'll just talk about these things. So ultimately, a lot of the discussions that I have and what I sort of experienced in the beginning was governmental funds, NIH funding, DOD funding, and then the desired outcomes. But what happens more often than not is that we set off after those funds and we sort of fall down shortly thereafter. This is a common scenario, especially for the MD. We get tied up with our patients, with our clinical responsibilities. Then we have families and we have houses and we have bills to pay. And then ultimately what happens more often than not is that we end up telling stories about the great idea that we had, but we just couldn't figure out how to parlay that into or translate that into the desired outcome. And what I've learned, and I think certainly a lot of people in the audience here probably already realize, is that the great expanse between our first step and those governmental or large grant funding mechanisms is ultimately preliminary data. And so we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. So if we start over and we think about taking an alternate approach, now that we've been lucky enough to go through the grant writing series this summer, we'll realize that the stepping stones between the large grants and the desired outcomes are smaller grants, and we sort of have to scratch and claw and figure out however we can get a little bit of money in the bank in order to get something done so that we can start to construct that bridge of preliminary data to our larger goals. And so where do those funds come from? Public organizations like the American Heart Association, for example, are places that offer grants to young investigators who may have an idea that fits with their long-term vision. Society funds are a great source of early funds for pilot trials. So in our case, the Society of Interventional Radiology, but of course all the other subspecialty societies have pilot funds that are a little bit easier to get than the governmental funds. And then training grants, Dr. Trindapani gave an entire talk in this series about the mechanism of training grants that can sort of take you from step one to larger fundings to R01, et cetera, by including training as well as some money for your pilot studies. And then departmental funds can bridge in between each one of these, which we have here, again, thanks to Dr. Kropinski. And then, so where does industry fit in? Potentially here, I think. And as I go through and get off on what sounds like or might seem like soapbox speeches or my own opinion or experience, I'll always try to bring it back to industry and the role industry plays in getting us to the big picture, to the greater goal, because that's the topic of this talk. So this is a slide provided by the Society of Interventional Radiology. The Society of Interventional Radiology Foundation is the research mechanism for young investigators and more senior investigators. But they have also a grant writing talk, and this is one of those slides. It sort of says the same thing in a different way, stratifying the potential or the usual disbursement of funds to an untrained or younger investigator all the way to an established investigator. And so industry funds bridge the entire career, of course, but I think the early investigator stage in the middle is probably where they're going to be most useful. These next two slides are also sort of under the auspice of the big picture, but also from the same Society of Interventional Radiology grant writing talk. And so the career flow chart is sort of self-explanatory, but the stumbling blocks in between are what I hope to identify. And the greater goal here, I guess, as we see, is early on we start as medical students and residents, and we have some mentor training, and we work our way through potential preliminary data acquisition and grant application, and then funding and so forth. I think you can see this intellectual property, and then promotion and career advancement, and then hopefully at some point we can do some good with all of this. Dr. Meltzer runs a fabulous young faculty workshop, and she articulated it so perfectly on that day that I remember. We come to places like this because we have sort of a sense of a calling for a higher purpose, that we hope to do something greater or impact our patients or humanity on a greater scale. So we want to keep that in mind as well as we go along, assuming that we share that motivation. So potential stumbling blocks along the way. Grantsmanship is a huge one that there's a lot of discussion around. There's a lot of confusion around, at least in the discussions that I've had and the interpretations that I hear from younger investigators or inexperienced investigators. And then the second most talked about transition in this career flowchart is that of intellectual property, the rules around intellectual property, what happens to all of your ideas. Do they sort of steal them from your mind as you walk in the door because you work here and you're therefore all of your ideas are given up? And there's a lot of misunderstanding about that as well. Presentation skills and scientific writing, won't talk so much about that. We learned that from our mentors. But the real crux of assuming that our goal is to get larger grants, to develop programs, and to be self-sustaining, the real crux of all of this is right here. We start with the preliminary data to serve as that bridge to larger amount of funding. Assuming that our preliminary data works how it's supposed to, and we use our grantsmanship skills, which I'm going to take a second to digress and talk about grantsmanship, but we use our grantsmanship skills. We're able to successfully acquire grant funding, which then develops additional data for us to feed back to the preliminary data stage. This is really the key. If we can set up this self-sustaining mechanism, then we can expand to programmatic research. So you'll remember our original guy who looked straight to funded grants and passed some of this early stuff. That also tends to look straight to intellectual property and kind of overlook the IP rules. So I'll take a few minutes to talk about this, and I'll bring it back to industry, I promise. So grantsmanship. So grant writing is easy, I think, which is not usually what you hear because there's so much confusion around what is grant writing and what is the language you have to use and the format and so forth. And this series has been so great in clearing a lot of that up. But at the end of the day, it's easy as long as you have something to say and you've already done the work. So, of course, the second one is kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing. But you find as you pursue these grants that you almost have to have the project already done by the time you apply for the grant, which creates this sort of cyclical, confusing thing, and I'll talk about that. So you have to have something to say, and so grant writing will be a lot easier if the idea that you have or what you hope to pursue is valuable, because then you can just say it. And I think that people run into confusion or sort of start to get bogged down trying to explain how they're going to get from A to B and sort of trying to make it sort of fancy it up and dress it up. But at the end of the day, if you have a solid idea, grant writing is a little bit easier because you can just say it. And then the second part, you've already done the work. It creates this cyclical thing. How can I do the work if I don't have any grant funding? And how can I get grant funding if I haven't done already some work? So right there is where industry comes in. We can sort of break this up. We can get some of the work done using outside dollars. Then you'll have something to say. You will have already done the work. And you have a better chance of getting a larger grant. And then the other thing about grantsmanship that I've learned along the way is the impact of the human reviewer. It is clear that there is no objective committee in the sky or software program that you can input the grant that you've generated after all these hours and hours and all of this sacrifice and input and receive an objective evaluation. Unfortunately, they're all viewed individually by human beings. So how can we mitigate this? How can we mitigate all of the biases and even sort of good moods and bad moods and things that human beings have and will ultimately take out on your grant potentially? Well, number one, number one, which is have something to say and just say it clearly. Because think about all the people that you know that review grants and think about how busy they are and how they've got their own, in our case, clinical schedules to manage, or in everyone's case, administrative things, and then all the domestic pressures, and then on top of that, they're reviewing grants. So if you have something to say and you say it clearly, I don't think that's an oversimplification. It makes things a lot easier for the grant reviewer, so they know what you're saying and they don't have to sort of muddle through it being dressed up. The second piece of advice I could potentially give, or I hope to give, is find an opportunity to review. I have learned so much about grantsmanship, grant reviewing, and the generation of grants by sitting on the other side. And again, you can sort of start in the same place. You can start at those public organizations. You can start at your own societies. They're usually looking for help with grant review. And then sitting in the grant review meetings in the study sections of these smaller places really gives you insight as to how they decide who gets this money. And then, as promised, we can always bring it back to industry because the motivations and biases of industry are a lot more clear. And so we know exactly what they want. And if we can accelerate their momentum toward their goal, that's a lot easier than dealing with a study section at the NIH. And then thick skin. So two places where we have to worry about thick skin. One is rejections. I think everybody who spoke in this series probably mentioned this, that it usually takes multiple rounds, multiple swings before you're successfully funded. And the reviewers who provide you the feedback won't necessarily be the reviewers that you get the second time around. So you can only sort of give it a limited amount of energy. And then feedback. I had a meeting with Dr. Garcia, other speaker in this series, and he made it very clear that he'd be happy to help me with any grant that I wrote as long as I didn't feel bad. And he and I realized that the only way he was going to be able to help me was to say all of these terrible things. And so and so he prepped me for that, and I appreciate that, and I'd much rather hear it from someone here at Emory with all of that experience and success than the grant reviewers themselves, especially some of these larger institutions that take 6 months to get back to. So Dr. Kapinski, you mentioned a little bit about this, or at least alluded to this. The other thing about grantsmanship that is extremely valuable to know is that most institutions, but we are here at Emory, have support systems for you to help you with some of these unknowns. And so this is just a screenshot from the Research Administration Services, the RAS, and then the Cancer and Imaging subsection is here, and then here's pre-award support. So what does that mean? It means that when you start to tackle one of these larger grant applications like the Department of Defense, in my case, you realize that there's an amazing amount of paperwork that goes into this, and maybe 20% of it is your science that you're trying to have something to say and say it clearly. The other 80% are budget forms and forms with very long numbers and multiple decimal points. And so this pre-award support team can help you with that, so you don't get bogged down. Kelly Ferguson is the team lead, and then there are multiple other people who work over there, all of whom are fantastic in helping you with these otherwise unknown parts. But to bring it back to industry, so this is an actual screenshot from one of the budgets that I had to generate for Cook. Cook Medical is one of the companies that supplies a lot of the interventional radiology and medical devices. And so we just wanted to secure some funding so that a postdoc could work in the lab. But to do that, you need to know things like what is going to be our overhead. This is 56%, of course, is different than the rates for the NIH, and I think it's even further stratified beyond that. But we don't need to know it because we've got the RAS, and they'll incorporate that into any amount of money that you're requesting or pursuing from industry. And then things like fringe benefits and salaries for your workers are all available to the RAS, and so you don't have to chase any of those down, and it can really grease the wheels in that respect.
Just however, it is important to actually know a little bit about the indirect costs, because when you're talking, you're not going to just start this de novo without ever talking to industry. They're going to, you're going to have talked to them, and it's good to warn them in advance. Most of them know it, some of them don't.
Right.
That you will be charging these indirect costs.
Right.
And sometimes it's a surprise, and they'll say, "Oh no, we don't." Well, what? We were just going to pay part of your salary.
That's right.
$10,000 flat fee.
That's right.
And you're like, no, it doesn't work that way. So they have to know in advance that you're going to be arguing for this extra 56%.
Right. That's so true. They do need to definitely know that, because if they don't know about it, so two scenarios. If they don't know about it and you tell them, oh, there's a 56% overhead charge, then these are business people. So what is that? But if they do know about it, as in this case actually, they sort of pretend like they don't know about it.
Yeah.
And so it is good to be upfront and explicit about that, because $20,000 becomes $12,000 very quickly.
And their indirect cost rates usually are in the 120% range or more. So.
Right.
And that is an
Excellent
important point
point.
as somebody who interacts with a lot of people sort of more on the industry side of stuff and have those conversations. I talk to lawyers and consultants. They still charge indirects. They just package them, they hide them
Right.
in their hourly rate.
That's right.
And we're transparent.
We are. We make a line
Once
item.
you say that, it changes the conversation.
So true. So true. The IP rules, another, if we can sort of go back and remember the larger picture and the career flow chart and where the stumbling blocks are. I have so many offline conversations about intellectual property, and Zach Burkew, I don't know if he was able to sign on, but put on, I think you were there, Dr. Juzak, a fantastic workshop for the interventional radiology department last week And I stole this slide from that. So Todd Shearer, who's our Associate Vice President for Research and the Director of the Office of Technology Transfer here at Emory, spoke and put up this slide, which I thought everybody should see this. We should hand this out on the way in because there's so much misunderstanding and discussion about this. And here are the actual numbers. So if we're talking about a device, for example, or something that's going to be marketable, a product that's the focus of our research, and we develop that here at Emory, exactly how much of it do we give up? And this is it. I mean, these are the numbers. Up to 25,000 gross revenue, all goes to the investigator. And then you can see the other numbers prior to and after your $4 million mark. What percent of the revenue comes back to the investigator? But of course, it's not that simple because the 33% that goes to the department potentially come back to you in a discretionary form. But even if not, certainly Emory is happy with the entire situation, and this is where we work, and we sort of have a collective goal here, and we've accomplished things that you probably otherwise wouldn't have been able to, and potentially put some good out into the world and satisfied that call for a higher purpose that we talked about earlier. But beyond that, if you remember all of this, that you're taking care of your patients and your family, and you've got these great ideas, and you're trying to pay your bills, and you realize that you'd like to pursue this idea that you have, but you really don't understand all of the things that you've got to do to translate that to market. And so in light of all these other responsibilities and everybody's overextension, it's extraordinarily valuable to have this Office of Technology Transfer with all of their resources. And even from a straight business standpoint, I'm not making a case for it, but just sort of one thing to think about. Even from a straight business standpoint, it's probably worth that 75%, that soft 75%, to get all of this expertise, given all of the other things that we have to do. I took a screenshot of one of, just for the audience here, in case you don't know. I'm not sure who knows and who doesn't, but this is the kind of feedback that you get from this office when you present them with an idea. So they go and they do patent searches and they do literature searches, and they decide whether or not prospectively there's any potential IP around your idea in the first place. So it's really a great resource to have. I mean, all those really small, so no one can steal my idea. That was their advice. But again, so let's talk more about, let's keep it on industry, since that's the topic, and not just all of the independent thoughts that I have about grant writing. This is an arteriogram. That's not a patient's name, so that's the operator's name. This is an arteriogram in a pig, and it's the delivery in the Cook lab of mesenchymal stem cells for potential treatment of bowel disorders. So I include this slide because I met with Cook early when I came, and I was sort of very excited about putting good back into the world and doing something fantastic. And I sat around a table like this, and I shared with them all of my ideas about making the world better. And about 3 months later, they sent me this arteriogram, and they had done all the experiments that I described to them at that table, which, much to my dismay, had sort of taken an idea and superimposed their resources onto it, and I was kind of left in the dust. So. But not to worry, because we have the Emory Office of Technology Transfer, who I think Dr. Krabinsky, if she has time, or if we have time, is going to talk more about this, but can protect you from this sort of thing prospectively by executing a non-disclosure agreement with these folks before you tell them all of your great ideas. So another potential advantage in the IP space related to industry. So. Grants and contracts, they are indeed different. This is a little bit of a boring part of the talk, I think, the dry part, so I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. So basically, a grant, as we all know, is our idea. We apply to sort of the more greener money places like the NIH and the DoD. It's often for basic research. And it's our agreement, it's their agreement to support our research, our idea. And one of the biggest things that we get from it is time. The ideas are originated by the applicant. This is the investigator who has gone out, done their due diligence, potentially acquired some preliminary data around their own idea, and then you're applying for support. And so as we all know, this is an incredibly competitive space with funding rates less than 10%, right? Still, so this is a tough crowd, and then allows a reasonable amount of freedom, meaning that once you acquire the grant, you have the money, and things change down the road. The PI is, of course, accountable in the end to the funding institution, but there's much less oversight along the way. And then a contract. So the contract, when it says an instrument to procure research, there is a little bit of a scale here. I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. But in its purest sense, it is exactly that, is a company or an industry looking to accomplish a goal, looking to have one of their products evaluated through the scientific mechanism. And so they'll go out with this idea, looking for places like this that they can contract in order to get their work done. Multi-center trials is one version of this. This is an example I can think of off the top of my head are the cryoablation trials. And so the company wants to run a multi-center trial for two reasons. One, to validate, well, many reasons, but one, to validate their product. Two, to sort of network and get the name of their product out there. And then three, as Dr. Duzak can explain to us so wonderfully, acquire data so we can translate that into a reimbursable code. But clearly they have a reason, and they have an intention, and they have tight control over something like this. Summary slide of the last slide, but what I want to point out is that there's a space in the middle here between a pure grant and a pure contract executed and initiated by industry and then executed by one of us. And the multi-center trials, I think, fall in between. And so what is our motivation then? If the company's motivation is to validate their product and to market their product and to potentially translate it into a reimbursable code, what is our advantage? Why would we get involved with the multi-center trials? So a few reasons why we would do that. It creates a network. Oftentimes these companies have done their homework and they have recruited some of the more influential members of your subspecialty to participate. And so your participation then automatically sort of involves you in that network. It also garners you some expertise. So if you're on the leading edge, even if it's industry initiated and industry sponsored, if you're on the leading edge of a modality in the investigation of a modality, then that garners you some expertise in your field. Dollars to the institution. Every time we engage in a multi-center trial, especially on the clinical side, it brings in procedures. So if we're using cryoablation as the example, patients who enroll in the multi-center trial are going to come here and have a procedure done, which is ultimately going to be reimbursed by the company to the institution. So it brings in cases. And then time. They will, from the clinical standpoint, they'll buy you off the schedule to do this, and anything that can get us time is usually very valuable. And so that's the multi-center industry initiated side of this. The other thing that falls in the middle, sort of investigator initiated, and this is something I've had a lot of experience with, which is you have an idea that you think might be in line with their idea as a company, and you go to them, which is a little bit different, right? So it's your idea. You bring it to them. You have a shared vision, so they like it. They think, well, this is potentially a new application for our product. We can expand our market. It all sounds good to them. The data ownership is less stringent than it is for the multi-center trials, which are clearly 100% owned by the company. Here you can negotiate ownership of the data. Not that you're going to translate that to any dollars for you in a business sense down the road, but from an academic standpoint, you have less oversight from the funding partner when you publish and you present. And that's what I mean. This is the non-IP space. This isn't for making money. And then again, time always comes back to time, I think.